Hi there, welcome to this second video in my series about birdsong in flute music. The last time we spoke about a number of pieces from the Baroque period through to the classical and early Romantic. In the musical examples that I played, I used a number of different flutes. I started off on a Baroque flute, I then played a wooden classical flute, and finished up on a silver Boehm system flute, the one that you most commonly see today. The Baroque flute is relatively primitive as an instrument. It's made from wood, as you can see, and most of the notes are played by covering holes with your fingers. In fact, there's just one key on that flute at the very bottom. Gradually, more and more keys were added to the instrument. It was to allow it to play chromatic notes and to help players to be more in tune with other instruments. There was also a bit of a shift in the material used, so players started to favour metal instead of wood, and it was thought to be a little bit more reliable in terms of intonation and also project a bit further. So as music started to be performed in concert halls rather than in churches and courts, the instrument needed to project a little bit more and keep up with louder instruments such as the violin and the piano. So the flute that we play today is not much different to the one that Boehm patented in 1847, the one that you would have seen Doppler perform on. And the first piece that I'm going to start with today was written just 3 years after Doppler's death. Carnival of the Animals was written by the French composer Saint-Saëns in 1886. Saint-Saëns was adamant that the piece was just a bit of fun. He saw it as detracting from his serious composer image, and so he didn't want it to be published in his lifetime. He only relented for one of the movements, the beautiful piece that we know as the Swan. The piece was published after his death and became one of his most well-known works. It remains much loved by audiences today, and especially by music teachers and young children, as it's really helpful in getting to know the instruments of the orchestra. Foliaire, or Aviary, is the 10th movement of the work, and it features the flute depicting the birds. The high strings create a background buzz like the sounds of the jungle, and the pianos interject here and there with the sounds of other little birds. But it's the virtuosic flute part that steals the show. One of Saint-Saëns' students was the composer Maurice Ravel. Ravel is often associated with Impressionism in music, and although he disliked that term, it does go some way to describe the music of his ballet Daphnis and Chloe. He described the piece as a choreographic symphony, and it premiered in 1912. The ballet's story is adapted from Greek mythology, which is fairly typical of that time. It concerns the love of the goatherd Daphnis and the shepherdess Chloe. Ravel extracted the music from the ballet to create 2 orchestral suites, and they can be performed with or without the chorus. At the beginning of the 2nd suite, we have the most beautiful musical description of daybreak. The flutes create the sound of a babbling brook, while the piccolo plays bird calls, and they set the scene for Chloe awakening. Around the same time as Daphnis and Chloe was written, a lesser well-known composer in Paris called Jules Muquet composed his most notable work, La Flûte de Pan. This piece is also based on Greek mythology and the god Pan, who is often depicted playing a flute. The piece is in 3 movements, and the second of those is called Pan et les oiseaux, Pan and the birds. The poetry that precedes the movement is, "Seated in the shade of this lonely wood, O Pan, How come you draw from your pipe such lovely sounds? The flute sets the scene of the birds at the beginning of the movement. We have grace notes, fast alteration, and swooping movements through the range of the flute, before a beautiful melancholy melody takes over. The first piece that we looked at today, Carnival of the Animals, has become a very useful piece in terms of music education, and that's the same with this next piece. Peter and the Wolf, a symphonic fairy tale for children, was written by the Russian composer Prokofiev in 1936. In this piece, a narrator tells the story, while each instrument depicts a certain character. The piece has become one of the most loved pieces of classical music and has been recorded many times. There have also been a lot of animations made, and the one by Disney was made after Prokofiev and Walt Disney met in 1938. Prokofiev himself described in the score, "Each character of this tale is represented by a corresponding instrument in the orchestra, the bird by a flute, the duck by an oboe, the cat by a clarinet playing staccato in a low register, the grandfather by a bassoon, the wolf by 3 horns, Peter by the string quartet, the shooting of the hunters by the kettle drums and bass drum." Before an orchestral performance, it is desirable to show these instruments to the children and to play on them the corresponding leitmotifs. Thereby, the children learn to distinguish the sounds of the instruments during the performance of this tale. And so we learn once again to associate flute with birds. We hear similar techniques as we've noticed before in pieces. Fast grace notes, very fast repeated notes, and swooping motion throughout the instrument's range. It's very effective in this piece. The last piece which I'm going to look at today is a personal favourite. It's also probably the inspiration behind this series looking at birdsong and flute music. The Mural Noir was composed by Olivier Messiaen in 1952. It was written as a test piece for the Paris Conservatoire. Messiaen was a very innovative composer of the 20th century. He used serialism, irregular rhythms, and he was very interested in birdsong. Le Mural Noir is the first piece that really explores one specific bird species. He had used birdsong before in a more generic way, for example in his most important work, Quartet for the End of Time. But from this point on in his compositions, we can start to see him quote birdsong more closely. The piece has contrasting sections, but you'll notice very active cadenzas imitating the bird calls, very fast grace notes. So next time, we'll take a look at how that piece has had an impact on composers writing today. We'll explore some music that's written much closer to home, and I look forward to seeing you then.